So, first of all, thank you, Sir Conrad Asji, for inviting me in this for this lecture. I thank India Facts for this very important series. Uh, to write or speak about Shri Ram Swarup ji is actually an audacity, particularly for someone like me. I became aware of Shri Ram Swarup ji and his writing in 2001 when my guru introduced me to him. Shri Ram Swarup ji had already passed away then. The first book of his which I ever got to read, and which people generally get to read, the first book which introduces Ram Swarup ji to people, was A Hindu View of Christianity in Islam, arguably his most popular work besides Understanding Islam Through Hadith. Back then, and I had a habit of highlighting the most important or unforgettable lines in any book that I read. I started this book, and midway I realized that I was actually painting the whole book. There was not a word which was misplaced, not a single line which could be edited out of the text. Not only the text was crisp, it was also literary, even about a subject so academic and so technical. The bar was set high, and reading his first book, I thought that it must be his best. But as I discovered other works of his, like Meditations, Yoga, God, and Religion, I realized he is one of the very best. His writing is like Updesh, delivered in a gentle tone and in the softest of words. It cleanses you, it heals you. He had the knack of talking about the harshest of topics in the calmest of tones. He never evaded even the most burning issues of his time. And yet there was never even a hint of anger in his writing. This is something very hard to achieve. And I have seen very few authors actually pulling it off, but Ram Sarupji was like that. This feature of his writing did not evolve over time, but was present from the very beginning. It is not known widely today that he also wrote extensively on communism and the red menace to India and the world. Actually, people know Sita Ramji more for writing on communism and the threat that communism poses to India and the world. But some of the first writings of Sri Ram Swarup ji can be found under the publication house and society called the Society for the Defense of Freedom in Asia. These works show Sri Ram Swarup ji to be quite prescient in his perception of communism, its methodology, its mechanisms, and its future in India and the world. Ram Swarup ji was writing at a great disadvantage at that time. At that time, India was head over heels in love with communism under the drunken leadership of Nehru, who was ready to disbelieve his own eyes for the sake of his belief in communism. The World War II had just ended, and the world had lost all desire to fight communism, except in a few circles in the US. It looked as if communism would become unstoppable and would soon take over India, for India was the last great third world country not taken over by by the communist bloc. The fall of China in 1950 was also very threatening. A few lone writers were writing against communism in the West. Robert Conquest was a prominent name. The great age of Soviet dissidents like Shalamov, Solzhenitsyn, and Kravchenko hadn't yet come. Some of them had just started writing, some of them had just defected to the West, and some of them hadn't even started. Even those who did write the reality about Soviet Union were hounded out of academia and discussion forums. Their voices at best were drowned in the communist propaganda. In this light, the condition of India was even worse, and the canards spread by Nehru and his psycho friends painted a picture of heaven on earth about Soviet Union. It is in these adverse circumstances that Sri Ram Sarupji wrote these penetrating books about communism. He started writing about the Red Menace as early as 1955. It is, when you consider the date, it is almost unthinkable. In a tract titled Where Are They? Communists Under Communism, he talks about the Great Purge of 1937-38 in Soviet Union and other communist countries, in which Stalin managed to kill most of the old guard of the Bolshevik Communist Party on trumped up charges and mock trials. These trials were reported in the West faithfully by the communist press, though not many believed in this propaganda as the charade was too much. But there were hardly any first hand witnesses who could tell the tale of exactly what had happened. The dominant sense about the whole macabre thing was a sense of bewilderment at best. In, in that era, Sri Ram Sarup ji, writing as early as 1955, was very clear about the agenda, the methodology, the strategy of communism. And this is how he describes the communists. I'll quote: the communist strategy is simple. It consists in serial liquidation of enemies, constituted of all the non communist opposition and the non proletarian sector of population. Blackmail, vilification, character assassination is the characteristic methods used to achieve this end. Opponents are labeled, split off, and played against one another. Communists fight the conservatives to the last socialists. Then the socialists themselves are divided and different splinters are picked off one by one. At the end, communists clamp down and put the lid on them all. Thus, after the victims have sufficiently weakened themselves in a struggle which is beyond their strength, to use Lenin's phrase, communists come at the top. Once the party is in power, the intra-party struggle becomes more acute at any rate. It becomes more visible and open because it takes on a physical form. Physical liquidation takes the place of the older methods of elimination when democracy prevailed. This is from Where Are They? In this tract, he explains how communism is an ideology so ruthless that except the supreme leader, no one is safe. It is not only the anti communists who are killed, it is not only the other types of socialists who are killed, but members of the ruling party, members of the Bolshevik party itself were not safe from the totalitarian terror of Comrade Stalin. This was the norm, far from being an exception. And Shri Ram Swarupji shows that this in the tract by giving a long list of various prominent communists killed by communists themselves in not just Soviet Union but most other communist countries of Europe. From the very beginning, Sri Ram Swarupji was very clear that the only weapon against communism is truth. He talks of creating a truth fund and exposing the methods and propaganda of communism to general public. Stressing on spreading truth does not mean that Sri Ram Swarupji was impractical about means of fighting powerful enemies. In a very surprising but refreshing tract written in 1955, Gandhism and Communism, Principles and Technique, Sri Ram Swarup talks about the definitions, theories, and practices of the two isms most fashionable in the India of 1950s. Sri Ram Swarupji shows great respect to Gandhi in general in this tract, but he is acutely aware of how Nehruvians and many communists were using to exploit the public sentiment that the word Gandhism could generate and use it in the service of communism. Sri Ram Swarupji sets about dispelling the notions about what Gandhism is and what it is not. Most prominently, he tells us that Gandhism cannot be equated to any form of Marxism or Stalinism, something which the socialists of those days were very fond of claiming. He tells us that divinity, religiosity, and God is at the very center of any Gandhian thought, and this is pure anathema to communism or socialism. He also tells us not to get bogged in the fine distinctions between the words like socialist, communist, leftist, Leninist, Marxist, and gives us the practical advice that the umbrella they use is one, and to any proponent of Hindu Dharma, any follower of Hindu Dharma, all of these systems, if they are different, to them, to us, they actually mean the same. He exposes the hypocrisy of those intellectuals who appealed in the name of Gandhism while opposing capitalism and blind industrialization, but ignored him completely while praising Soviet Union or other communist countries. In this tract, he debunks the hypocrisy of those closet socialists who go by the name of Gandhians. But a very important point which one realizes upon reading this tract is that instead of discarding Gandhism in total, Sri Ram Swarupji uses it as a dike for criticizing the great evils of his time. And he considered communism to be the greatest evil of his time. So Gandhism was something that he could use against the greatest evil of his time, and he did. So it also shows us his pragmatic mind. He starts another such tract written in 1954 with these words. Today we face a grave problem. Look at the prescient words of Sri Ram Swarupji. I quote, "Today we face a grave problem, the problem of a communist threat to our national freedom and cultural heritage, to the human spirit and mind themselves. The threat is not local, but universal, not to India alone, but to humanity and the world over. Not only to the institutions of private property and individual initiative, but to the democratic values of liberty and civil rights, but to the deeper values and urges of mankind." I think I have not read any other tract which sums up this thread so beautifully in so few words, which was actually characteristic of Sri Ram Swarup. In this tract too, he discusses how Gandhism is being distorted and misappropriated by socialists of all hue. But he also takes care to expose the untenable propositions in Gandhism. In very soft words, which was again customary, he says that Gandhism is not a system, but a personality cult. And without the personality, it will not work. He also warns against being neutral in the war between capitalism and communism. Fully knowing the limitations of the former, Sri Ram Swarupji nevertheless saw communism as pure evil and said that being neutral in such an important fight is nothing short of supporting evil. And every Hindu should oppose communism with all the might he can. He believed that India had a great role to play in world affairs. and it should present a spiritual point of view in this war of worldviews and ideology. But Sri Ram Swarup never fails from informing us more and more about the true nature of communism. He tells us that the evidence, the violence in communism is not incidental but institutional, employed for a very specific goal. Because we often make this mistake that a certain system, we often claim that this may be just an exaggeration of the principle, but he negates it here. He says that it was not some practice of communism that went out of hand and became violent. The very principle, the very ideology is wrong, evil, or violent at the first place. I quote once again: communist violence is not impulsive, it is organic, inherent, cultivated, calculated, and planned. After it has captured power, it is sustained and institutionalized. Throughout its history, it is not only externally directed, but also internally perfected. It operates not only through the world's most massive armed strength, it also maintains a powerful fifth column throughout the world. It utilizes ideology, exploits and sharpens conflicts among its victims, sells confusion and distrust, and morally blackens its opponents. Communist violence is gross as well as subtle, open as well as hidden. It is a total whole time thing. He says this in Gandhism and Communism once again. So once again, a very, very good summary of the tactics of the communists. And if we see the contemporary condition of India today, the same conditions prevail, the same enemies, they use the same tricks. Of course, communism, the communist states, most of them are gone, but the machinery is in place. And in order to break Hinduism, they are still employing the same methods, which can very well be seen in this paragraph that I just quoted. Another confusion prevailing among those times in India was that as communism espoused atheism, and Indian Darshan also supported some systems which were called by some as atheists in modern times. So communism should actually be acceptable to Indian society. This was actually something that the socialists of those times claimed sometimes. Ram Sarup squarely dismisses these notions and tells us that atheism of communism is of an entirely different kind. Once again, I quote, but the new communist atheism is different. It is a state creed, politically organized, psychologically manipulated, and enforced with the help of the police. It involves roaring publishing business, millions of trained agitators, organization of social censor and praise, reward and punishment, large scale indoctrination, complete suppression of any rival point of view. The high pressured publicity of which the present technical civilization is capable is pushed in the service of inculcating atheism. Education, press, radio, film all serve the same purpose. In the present day Russia, a certain amount of piety and ritualism is allowed as a concession to world opinion among persons and groups who may choose to remain in the backwaters of life. But any living manifestation of divine life is at once reported to the police and destroyed physically. So this is a very important strain that we see. We still see that a very violent sort of atheism is pushed on Hindus still in 21st century. And we can see actually Ram Sarup as someone as prescient to be dictating what would happen when these all of this rights activism and all of these different hues of liberalism are working against Hindu society or Sanatan Dharma today. Once again, drawing attention to his pragmatism, taking help of the dominant thought of his times, he tries to fight communism, the greatest menace of his time. In Foundations of Maoism, a longer work published in 1966, Sri Ram Swarup discusses the Chinese threat to India under the deadly ideology of communism. At that early stage, Sri Ram Swarup advocated creating a zone of buffer states all around India to save it from Chinese advances. That we fail to listen to his advice is evident today, when China is at all of our gates on all sides. In this tract, he analyzes the delusions of Indian Maoists and Marxists who supported everything that their comrades did in China. This was a phrase, new democracy. This new democracy is democracy only in the name. It is actually a tool of communism, and there is nothing go into detail, but in this track, he analyzes the character of Maoism, Chinese Communist Party, and communism in general, that it is worthy of reading even now in 2020, when the archives have opened in Moscow, and a lot of communist methodology in hindsight now seems very clear to the scholars working now. But to someone writing in 1966 in India, with all the disadvantage of a very working Soviet Union communist international machinery, this seems very, very surprising. Indian Maoists and Marxists were also in raptures over the new economy of China. The new economy was nothing but confiscation of private property by the ruling Communist Party of China. Shri Ram Swarupji analyzes it and makes it very clear. He also busts the myth that China under Maoism had created food surplus. Needless to say, all of these are the fodder of Indian Maoists and communists. He once again exposes the new culture of Maoist China, where individuals are forced to confess to their anti-communist thought crimes and wrong ways of thinking in front of hundreds of people. It was a common strategy of communists in Soviet Union as well as China to make individuals confess for ideological crimes like thinking in a capitalist way. The drive was termed in China as change brain campaign. It was a psychological and sociological tool that Maoists deployed with ferocity. Another important point that Sri Ramsarupji does not miss is the inveterate hostility of Maoists against the Confucian ethics. This is a very important point. It was the Confucian ethics which is the daily life of the Chinese. It governed their rituals, customs, and ways of thinking and looking at the world. Sharp enough to realize that if communism had to take root in China, in a traditional culture and civilization like China, Confucian ethics had to be rooted out. Sri Ram Sarupji points this out very prominently. He tells us how communism is inherently and ideologically at odds with any indigenous and custom of ethics and morality. Maoism was not at good terms with spiritualisms like Taoism either. Sri Ram Sarupji quips in a very short sentence, Maoism is fast replaceable. So in India too, we see this reflected. This is the reason that communism is against the dharma shastras of Hindus. The same reason that they oppose Confucian, because they know that this is what governs the daily life of a Hindu. And if that is destroyed, he will be ready for harvest by any predatory ideology like Christianity. Not neglecting the menace that Maoist China posed to India's sovereignty and national integrity, Sri Ram Sarupji also exposes Nehruvian policy in India of serving Chinese needs first, ignoring even India's interests. He says how when Tibet was invaded, Nehru and his cabal silenced the sane voices of Sri S.P. Mukherjee, Sri M.R. Masani, and various others. He of China by indicating what it did to the native culture and people of not only Tibet, but also Xinjiang. It is an evil force bent at human servitude. He does not shy away from saying that in the language of the Gita, Maoism is an Asuric force. He warns us that China is pumping money in India for funding media persons and academicians to lobby for China in Indian political, academic, and media space. Facing such a concerted attack against India's society, polity, and culture, we need to put up the best defense that we can. But finally, he said that fighting the Chinese menace militarily won't be enough. Like he has always been saying, until the very ideology of communism is defeated, it can't really be defeated. He made it clear that Maoism, like Leninism or Stalinism, was a two-pronged attack. While they attack you militarily from outside, while trying to erode the indigenous institutions from the inside by sponsoring spies and propagandists. Expanding on Leninism and Stalinism, he tells us that they need professional revolutionaries because it is an artificial system which no public would ever support on its own. He says that political and economic ways are not sufficient ways to fight Maoism and Leninism. One needs to fight the communist menace at the level of ideology. It has to be fought ideologically, doctrinally, and organizationally. Decades after his advice, we still fail to listen to him very properly, and we see the result. He did not miss the mass stirrings that were happening in West Bengal. Explaining the strategies and actions of the Communist Party in Bengal, he described the situation of riots there and how the police was helpless fodder against the miscreants. His descriptions have a very uncanny similarity to the CAA riots that took place recently in Delhi and India and all over India. Uh, we seem to be repeating this. It makes me glad and also painful to see that Sri Ram Sarupji, saints like Sri Ram Sarupji and Sita Ramji have been warning us about these things. This was written in 1966 and other tracks were written in 1955. They have been warning us for the last 65 years and continuously menace ideologically, not just militarily or star over West Bengal. He warns of the intimidating tactics of communists and how they gradually force individuals into ideological submission. At last, I would like to quote a few lines by him, warning us about communism in once again very, very crisp words. Communism of monogamy, the whole spiritual evolution of man is at stake. Fashionable pacifism, which is blind to this fact, must be rejected. And with this, he warns us that this menace has to be fought at a much, much deeper level, institutionally, but also spiritually. So, communism is dead in Soviet Union. It is still alive as a mercenary network of institutions, selling their services to any bidder who is invested in anti-Hinduism and the destruction of Hindu culture and civilization. There is still time to heed his advice and fight the civilization enemies of India and Sanatan Dharma, like Islam and Christianity, ideologically and institutionally. But only if we pay enough heed to his words. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sir Els, for giving me this opportunity to speak in this event. When I started reading Ram Swarup ji, I'd never thought I would be fortunate enough to speak at an event like this. The only emotion that I have now is that of gratitude for the understanding that Shri Ram Swarup